45 minutes, that is how long it lasted. From the first musket shot to the last British soldier dropping his weapon in surrender. 45 minutes on a cold January morning in 1781 on a cattle pasture in the back country of South Carolina that most Americans could not find on a map today. What happened in those 45 minutes effectively ended Britain's ability to win the Revolutionary War. Not Lexington, not Bunker Hill, not Saratoga, which gets all the attention and deserves much of it. A cattle pasture in South Carolina that nobody outside military historians and local history enthusiasts has ever heard of. The Battle of Cowpens. The British force that walked into that pasture on January 17, 1781 was not a garrison unit or a second-rate regiment. It was one of the finest light infantry and cavalry forces in the entire British Army in America. The unit that had terrorized the Carolina backcountry for months, that American forces had run from, that had never been seriously challenged. The American commander who set the trap had fewer men, no cavalry advantage, and an army that included militia units so unreliable he built his entire battle plan around the assumption they would run. They ran. Exactly when and exactly how far he told them to. And then the trap closed. In 45 minutes, the British lost over 900 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The American commander lost fewer than 80. It was the most tactically perfect battle of the entire Revolutionary War. And it is the battle almost nobody remembers. This is the full story of Cowpens. And by the end of it, you will understand why 45 minutes in a South Carolina pasture changed everything. To understand Cowpens, you have to understand how desperate the American situation in the South had become. By the summer of 1780, Britain's southern strategy was working. The British had taken Savannah in 1778. They had taken Charleston in May of 1780. The largest American military defeat of the entire Revolution, with over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendering along with the city. It was a catastrophe from which the Southern Continental Army would take months to recover. And then came Camden. In August of 1780, the reconstituted American Southern Army under General Horatio Gates, the same Gates who had taken credit for Saratoga, met the British Southern Army under Lord Cornwallis at Camden, South Carolina. The result was another disaster. The American army was routed, scattered, and effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Gates himself fled the battlefield on horseback and did not stop for 60 miles. The backcountry of the Carolinas was now open to British operations. Loyalist militias were rising throughout the region. Patriot militias were being hunted down and destroyed. The population that had supported the revolution was being systematically intimidated into submission. It looked, in the summer and early autumn of 1780, like the South had been lost. What kept it from being lost was something the British strategic plan had not fully accounted for: the fury of the Carolina backcountry population at the methods being used to pacify it. British and Loyalist forces were not gentle in their campaign. Houses were burned, prisoners were executed. The rules of war, as the 18th century understood them, were frequently ignored. The backcountry erupted. Partisan leaders operating in the interior of the Carolinas began organizing resistance that the British could not suppress. These were not Continental soldiers. They were local men who knew every trail and farm and hiding place in the countryside, who could strike and vanish before a response could be organized, who had personal reasons for the fight that went beyond ideology. In October of 1780, a combined force of backcountry militia destroyed a Loyalist force at Kings Mountain. 900 men killed or captured in a single afternoon. The British Southern Army was not broken, but the assumption that loyalists could pacify the countryside between British columns was cracking. And in October of 1780, a new American commander arrived in the South to take charge of what remained of the Continental forces there. Nathaniel Greene arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina in December of 1780 to command the Southern Department of the Continental Army. What he found was, by any honest measure, barely an army. Fewer than 2,000 men, most of them without adequate clothing, shoes, or food. The supply system was in ruins. The soldiers' morale was the morale of men who had watched two armies destroyed under two different commanders in the same year. Greene was one of Washington's most trusted officers. He was a Quaker from Rhode Island who had taught himself military strategy from books and had developed, over 5 years of war, a strategic mind that was as good as anything the Revolution produced. He made two decisions immediately that defined everything that followed. The first was to divide his army, a move that every military textbook of the era said was dangerous when facing a superior enemy. He sent a detachment under Daniel Morgan, one of the finest combat commanders of the war, into the Carolina backcountry to recruit militia, harass British supply lines, and threaten the British left flank. The second was to embrace a strategy of endurance over a strategy of victory, to keep his army in existence, force the British to overextend themselves, and wait for an opportunity that concentrated force could exploit. He wrote to Morgan with instructions that were models of clear strategic thinking. Keep moving. Draw the British after you. Do not let them bring you to battle on their terms. Make them chase you until they are exhausted and their supply lines are stretched to breaking. Morgan did exactly that. And then the British sent someone to catch him. Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton was 26 years old, and he was the most feared British cavalry commander in America. He led the British Legion, a mixed force of cavalry and light infantry, mostly loyalist Americans, that had been terrorizing the Carolina backcountry since the spring of 1780. He was aggressive to the point of recklessness, fast-moving, brutal in his methods, and extraordinarily successful. He had destroyed American forces at Waxhaws in May of 1780, a battle that American accounts described as a massacre and that made his name synonymous with a particular kind of merciless warfare. American soldiers who encountered the British Legion ran, not always, but often enough that Tarleton had developed the habit of expecting panic when he pressed hard and fast, and the habit had served him well. Cornwallis dispatched Tarleton to find Morgan and destroy him. The instructions were straightforward. Move fast. Find the American force. Attack before it can escape or be reinforced. The same formula Tarleton had applied successfully throughout 1780. Tarleton moved fast. He pursued Morgan through the Carolina backcountry in the bitter cold of January 1781, crossing swollen rivers and pushing his men at a pace that exhausted them before they reached the battlefield. Morgan was running. He knew Tarleton was behind him. He knew the broad river was ahead of him, swollen with winter rain, and that crossing it with his force would take time he might not have. He made a decision that most commanders, pressed by a fast-moving pursuer with a reputation for violence, would not have made. He stopped running. He turned around. And he chose his ground. The place Morgan chose was called the Cowpens, a known landmark in the Carolina backcountry, an area of open woodland that local cattle drovers used as a grazing and gathering point. The terrain was open enough to see across, gently rolling, with a low hill near the center. It looked, to most experienced military eyes, like a terrible choice for a defensive position. There was no natural barrier at the rear, no river, no ravine, no obstacle that would prevent an army from retreating or being pushed back in any direction. The standard military wisdom of the 18th century said you wanted your back protected. Morgan's back was open. Tarleton, when he learned where Morgan had stopped, was pleased. Open ground was cavalry ground. His horsemen could be decisive on open ground in ways they could not in forest or swamp. What Tarleton did not fully account for was that Morgan had chosen the ground precisely because it had no rear obstacle. Morgan knew his militia. He had spent his career leading backcountry fighters, and he understood them in ways that most Continental officers did not. He knew that militia ran when they were frightened. He had seen it at Camden. He had seen it in a dozen smaller engagements. The standard Continental Army approach was to put militia in the line and hope they held, and they usually didn't. Morgan did not hope for anything. He planned for exactly what the militia would do. He arranged his force in 3 lines. The first line, the skirmishers, were sharpshooters placed forward to harass the British advance and then fall back. Their only instruction was to fire twice and withdraw. The second line, the militia, were positioned behind the first. Their only instruction was to fire 2 full volleys and then withdraw to the left and rear around the hill. The third line, the Continental regulars and experienced veterans, were on the hill itself, with the cavalry behind them. The open rear was not a weakness. It was the path the militia would use to withdraw, reform, and return when the time came. Morgan walked the lines the night before the battle, talking to his men. He explained what he needed from each group. He told the militia he did not need them to hold. He just needed 2 volleys. He told the Continentals they were going to stand and fight. He slept that night and woke his army before dawn. Tarleton arrived at Cowpens at dawn on January 17, 1781. His force had been marching since 3 in the morning on roads that were barely passable. His men were tired. His horses were exhausted. The disciplined commander might have rested his troops before attacking. Tarleton did not rest. He had learned to hit hard and fast before the Americans could escape, and that formula had never failed him. He deployed his force and ordered the advance. The British line moved forward across the open ground. The American skirmishers fired, targeted the officers specifically. Morgan had told his riflemen to aim for the epaulettes and withdrew. The British line kept advancing. The militia fired their first volley, then their second. Then they withdrew, exactly as Morgan had told them, moving to the left and around the hill. Tarleton saw the militia running and did exactly what Morgan wanted him to do. He ordered a charge. His cavalry swept forward on the right. His infantry pushed hard in the center. His reserve Highlanders moved up on the left. The British line was charging now, men cheering, the formula of aggressive pursuit that had worked all year being applied with full confidence. They hit the Continental line on the hill. The Continentals did not run. They fired a volley at close range that staggered the British advance. The British line pressed forward. The Continentals fired again and again. On the British right, the cavalry swept around to hit the American flank and ran into John Howard's Continental infantry, who had wheeled to face them, standing in formation, waiting. Behind the hill, the militia that Tarleton thought had fled had reformed. Morgan rode among them, telling them the day was going well, that one more volley would finish it. They came back over the hill and hit the British infantry in the flank just as the Continentals were pressing them from the front. And on the American right, William Washington's Continental Cavalry, the force that had been held in reserve behind the hill, swept around and hit the British cavalry before it could reorganize. The British line, which had been advancing in triumph 30 seconds before, was now being hit from 3 directions simultaneously. It broke. not a tactical withdrawal, a rout. Men throwing down their weapons and running. Officers trying to rally troops that were no longer listening. Tarleton himself trying to organize a countercharge with his reserve cavalry that was scattered before it could form. The battle lasted 45 minutes. When it was over, the British Legion, Tarleton's pride, the terror of the Carolina backcountry, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 900 men killed, wounded, or captured, 2 field artillery pieces captured, 800 muskets captured, the regimental colors taken. Tarleton escaped with a fragment of his cavalry, fewer than 200 men. Morgan lost fewer than 80. What happened immediately after Cowpens was almost as important as the battle itself. Morgan knew that Cornwallis, when he learned what had happened, would come after him in force. The British commander had just lost the most effective mobile force in his army. He would be furious, and he would want it back. Or rather, he would want revenge, which is a different thing, and often produces worse decisions. Morgan was right. Cornwallis was furious. The British commander did something unusual and revealing when he received the news of Cowpens. He destroyed his own army's supply wagons, burned them, along with most of the non-essential equipment, the tents, the extra clothing, the provisions that turned a light force into a sustainable army. He made his force fast and lean and stripped of everything except what it needed to march and fight. He was going to catch Morgan, and then he was going to catch Greene, and he was going to destroy the American Southern Army, regardless of what it cost him. What followed was a race across North Carolina in the dead of winter, the race to the Dan, as historians have called it. Greene and Morgan marched north, keeping just ahead of Cornwallis's pursuing army. The British moved at a pace that would have been extraordinary in good conditions, and was nearly superhuman in January on roads that were turning to mud. They came close. Several times they nearly caught the American rear guard. They did not catch them. Greene crossed the Dan River into Virginia with his army intact, taking all the available boats with him, leaving Cornwallis standing on the southern bank with no way to cross. The race was over. The Americans had won it, and Cornwallis, having burned his supplies and exhausted his army in pursuit of an enemy he could not catch, now had to think about what came next. Cornwallis needed a decisive engagement. He needed to destroy the American Southern Army in a pitched battle to justify the campaign he had run, the supplies he had burned, and the casualties he had taken. He maneuvered back into North Carolina, and Greene followed him. On March 15, 1781, the two armies met at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. The British won the battle. Technically, they held the field at the end of the day, which is the 18th century measure of tactical victory. They paid for it with over 500 men killed or wounded, more than a quarter of Cornwallis's effective force. Some of the regiments that fought at Guilford Courthouse had begun the Southern campaign the previous year with 800 men. They finished it with fewer than 200. Charles James Fox, the opposition leader in the British Parliament, heard the casualty figures for Guilford Courthouse and made one of the most famous comments in British parliamentary history. "Another such victory," he said, "and we are undone." He was right. Cornwallis could not afford another battle like that one. He could not replace the men. He could not replace the officers. The Southern Army that was supposed to pacify the Carolinas was now too weak to hold what it had taken, and too exhausted to fight for more. He marched to the Virginia coast. He waited for naval resupply and reinforcement. He went to Yorktown. Military historians argue about causation. Every battle has a chain of events before it and after it. And saying that one engagement decided a war is always an oversimplification. But Cowpens is as close to a single decisive engagement as the Revolutionary War produced. Here is the chain. Morgan destroys Tarleton's legion at Cowpens. Cornwallis, furious and determined, burns his supplies and pursues Morgan and then Greene across North Carolina. The pursuit exhausts his army and costs him the men he could not afford to lose. Guilford Courthouse produces casualties he cannot replace. He retreats to the Virginia coast and goes to Yorktown. At Yorktown, the French fleet seals the bay, and Washington arrives with the combined army. Cornwallis surrenders. Remove Cowpens from that chain, and the chain breaks. Without Cowpens, Tarleton's legion continues its operations in the backcountry. The partisan resistance that was beginning to coalesce has no dramatic victory to rally around. Cornwallis does not burn his supplies in pursuit of a beaten enemy. He conserves them and operates from a position of strength. The systematic pacification of the Carolinas, which was failing but not yet failed, has time to continue. The 45-minute battle at a cattle pasture in South Carolina set in motion a sequence of events that led directly to the surrender at Yorktown 9 months later. Not the only cause, not the only factor, but the hinge on which the Southern campaign turned. And the Southern campaign was the last major British effort to win the war. Daniel Morgan never fought another battle after Cowpens. His health collapsed in the weeks after the engagement. He had been suffering from rheumatism that made riding agony, and the winter campaign in the Carolinas had pushed him past what his body could sustain. He resigned his command and went home to Virginia. He had won one battle, one complete, tactically perfect battle against a superior force in which he had used the supposed weakness of his troops as the central element of his plan. Banastra Tarleton went back to Britain and eventually entered politics. He spent the rest of his life arguing that Cowpens had not been his fault, that the ground was wrong, that his men were tired, that Morgan had been lucky. He was not entirely wrong about any of these things. The ground was chosen specifically to defeat him. His men were exhausted from the night march. Morgan had the advantage of choosing when and where to fight. But luck is what you call it when the other commander is better than you, and you do not want to say so. Morgan was better. He understood his troops in ways Tarleton did not understand his. He built a plan around what his militia would actually do, rather than what he wished they would do. He chose ground that turned his enemy's greatest advantage, cavalry on open terrain, into a trap. And he executed the plan with a tactical precision that military academies still study 2.5 centuries later. 45 minutes. 9 months before Yorktown. One battle that almost nobody remembers, that decided a war that everyone knows. If that changes how you think about how history is made, not in the famous battles, but sometimes in the ones nobody talks about, hit subscribe. Every week on Reckoning, we cover the full history behind the wars, decisions, and moments that shaped the world you live in. Drop a comment below. Had you heard of Cowpens before today? We read everyone. And if you learned something today, the like button helps more people find this channel. We will see you in the next one.